Hello again, little one. I noticed you saw me reading and immediately started making your way towards me. It's cute. Were you curious about what I was reading this time? Well, luckily for you, I'm just about done with some of this. Would you like to hear about it? Alright, come here and get comfy. So, this time I was reading about Amaterasu and Susanoo, the sun and the storm god. Remember how some time ago I told you about Izanami and Izanagi? Well, when Izanagi escaped from the underworld, Yomi, he purified himself in a river with a misogi ritual, resulting in three major kami, or gods, being born. Them being Amaterasu, Tsukuyomi, and Susanoo. Amaterasu was born from Izanagi when he washed his left eye, and she became the ruler of the heavens, also known as Takamagahara, or it's a little bit of a tongue twister. Takamagahara. Anyway, she is basically the embodiment of light, order, and divine sovereignty. We have Tsukuyomi, who was born from his right eye, and he became the moon god. And then we have Susanoo, born from his nose, being a storm god. And he is associated with, chaos and the ocean, raw emotions. Amaterasu and Susanoo do represent opposing natural forces, both the sunlight and storms, or, stability and upheaval, concepts like rulership and rebellion, um, which is quite interesting because in most Western mythologies, the concept that's usually opposed to um, sun or light is usually darkness. And in some cases, that's usually associated with the moon or some other entity, usually death as well. Um, so it's kind of interesting that for the Japanese pantheon or for Japanese mythology, it's the sun and the storms of all things. Anyway, so Izanagi wanted to assign domains to each of his children. Through this, Amaterasu would rule the heavens, Tsukuyomi would rule the night, Susanoo would rule the ocean or the sea. Susanoo, however, refused his duty, and instead he wept and raged, resulting in mass destruction. So he threw a fit. When he was asked why, he claimed that he wanted to see his mother, Izanami, in the underworld. Before he descended, Susanoo decides to visit Amaterasu. However, his violent arrival, him thundering across the heavens, made her very wary of him. So, she decided to test him. They ended up performing this ritual in which they exchanged some sacred items. Amaterasu took Susanoo's sword and created three female kami from it. Susanoo ended up taking her jewels and made 5 male kami. They both then proceeded to argue over who created the more pure kami, and Susanoo claimed victory. And of course, he was being arrogant and destructive while doing so. From this came a spree of chaotic deeds done by Susanoo. He destroyed Amaterasu's rice fields, he defiled her sacred hall, and then he threw a flayed horse into her weaving room, which made some of her attendants die from fright. Amaterasu was horrified by his actions, and thus hides herself in the celestial rock cave known as Amano Iwato. And this plunges the world into darkness. Of course, this is all, symbolism for why eclipses happen. Basically, if chaos runs rampant, then the sun will disappear from the sky. And remember, Amaterasu is like the literal sun. She's she's the personification of the sun. So just like, a way to represent the sun. So imagine just a person. Instead of it being a giant ball in the sky, it's, a woman. Well, Susanoo is just like a man, right? Anyway, the other gods, of course, wanted Amaterasu to return, so they gathered outside the cave and they performed this sacred but comedic dance. It was performed mainly by another goddess known as Ame no Uzume. She's another very prominent figure in the pantheon. And this dance basically causes everyone around her to be merry with laughter and excitement, which piques Amaterasu's curiosity. And she peeks out from behind the rock, causing the other gods to pull her from the cave and seal it shut behind her, so she cannot retreat. So that's a pretty funny scene. Here you have a bunch of gods just having fun outside of a rock, or sorry, outside of a cavern entrance. And then Amaterasu gets really curious about why everyone's laughing and having fun. So they just pull her out and then seal the cave behind her. Anyway, this is all just like one big metaphor for the restoration of light and order, which results in Susanoo being banished from heaven. He gets cast down into the mortal realm and has his power reduced, which marks a turning point in things. So, now that Susanoo is in exile, he is forced to mature to control his emotions. And eventually, he does redeem himself. He fights a eight-headed serpent known as Yamata no Orochi, who was causing chaos in the mortal realm. So imagine just a giant snake. And I don't mean like, a few meters tall, right? Like this thing was huge. It was the size of buildings, or like the size of towers. And it had eight heads. And it was basically being satiated through human sacrifice. They would a lot of the locals would offer up innocent women for him to consume, which is pretty messed up. But he ends up slaying it, and during the fight, he cuts off his tail, and inside of Orochi's tail, um, Susanoo manages to pull out this legendary sword known as Kusanagi no Tsurugi. And that's what he uses to offer to Amaterasu in order to make peace with her, which allows their relationship to be mended. Now, the sword itself is very important. It ended up becoming one of the three imperial regalia of Japan. Basically, it's one of the three sacred treasures for the country, which is pretty neat. Like I said, there are three. The other two, if you're interested, are this mirror known as Yata no Kagami and a jewel, uh, which is the Sakane no Magatama. And they're all just representations of the virtues that are most important to Japan. The sword being valor, the mirror being wisdom, and the jewel being benevolence. Oh yeah. Regarding those treasures, so technically, no one has ever really seen them before. um, I guess maybe those outside of like the Japanese government, but Japan tells us they exist and that they have them somewhere, like in storage, right? Because they're very, very important to the nation. But we've never actually seen them. If you look at pictures of these things, you might only find like artistic depictions, as in either paintings or mock-ups done by people. Because again, like they've never taken a picture of these items and then just shown them to the public, which makes sense. I mean, again, they're very, very important to Japan, so we kind of just have to take their word for it. Anyway, um, let's look at some quick symbolism from this story. So, Amaterasu is, of course, the symbol of sunlight, right? As well as the imperial lineage and sacred authority, which we covered a while ago. She is this divine ancestor of a lot of Japanese emperors. Susanoo is a bit more of a complex figure. He's destructive at first. He's wild with his nature and then using his destructive force to be this heroic figure. So he's a literal, like, crazy force of nature and emotion before he redeems himself eventually. Now, while the myth is a lot more complicated, it does signify the importance of the balance needed between order and chaos, and how even those who are divine are not exempt from needing to be humbled in order to be purified so that harmony can be restored. That's the like general gist of things. It's kind of interesting how, you know, the gods in most mythologies, they are revered, right, as these great figures. They are supposed to be the ultimate symbol for whatever it is that they represent, be it the arts, or just music, or, an element like the sun, or lightning, or storms, or, anything you can think of, wine, merriment. They're all these, like, omnipotent, just very powerful beings. And despite that, they still have a lot of quote unquote human traits to them, right? Like, here you have Susanoo. Again, he's the literal representation of, like, how crazy nature can get. So it makes sense that his emotions fluctuate all the time. But just imagine, like, a big brother just teasing his sister, but, like, being very rude about it. Like, a big brother would probably, I don't know. Let's say his sister is like a kid and he's, a teenager. He would probably, like, hide her doll or something, right? And tease her that way. She would be like, "Oh, what did you do to my doll? Blah 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 blah. Where is it?" Meanwhile, Susanoo thrashes her room and whips a horse to death and then throws it into another, like, part of her house. He's super messed up. But again, that's his whole character arc, right? Here you can see a lot of the just humanity that's that still inhabits these godly creatures. And it's pretty interesting. It's just an interesting thing to think about how despite them being these godly entities, they still have quite a few flaws to them. Look at the time. It flew by, didn't it? Did you have fun hearing about the sun and the storm god this time? I'm glad. Thank you for listening to me ramble on about mythologies that I read up on. You're such an attentive little pupil. You know, maybe next time I'll quiz you, just to make sure you were actually paying attention. Still, that's it for today's lesson. When I research more stuff, I'll let you know, okay?